Okay, so let's begin. Today we are going to talk about human impacts, which is actually a nice tie-in to what we did last time. Last time we looked at invasive species, and we talked about um, the impact that things like pythons have in Florida. The problem, if you remember, with invasive species is that the native species, the things that are there, they're not used to the new species coming in, and they don't know how to deal with them, and that's a big problem. So here's a nice little tie-in. Think about like the COVID-19 outbreak that we're experiencing right now, and compare that to the problem that an invasive species poses on natural organisms or native organisms in the environment. Remember, the python is an invasive species, and the problem is a lot of the animals that are being eaten by the python, they don't know how to deal with the pythons. They've never seen it before, right? Uh, how is it similar to what's happening right now between us and COVID-19? This is actually a strong parallel there, right? This is a what? This is a new type of virus. And an invasive species is like a new species coming into an area that's it's never been there before, right? If you remember the problem with dodo bird, the problem with the dodo bird is the sailors brought invasive species to the island. The dodo bird was not used to predators. Its nest was on the ground. It didn't know how to deal with things like rats and dogs and pigs. And there's a similar problem when you think about what's happening with COVID-19. Our immune systems haven't seen this virus before. So that's one of the reasons why it's spreading so easily, and it's causing such a high mortality rate amongst us, right? So there's a strong parallel between what's happening with uh, you know, when you humans experience or come in contact with a new virus, it's very similar to when organisms that are native to an area encounter invasive species. Very, very similar problem. Don't know how to deal with these things. So today we're going to talk about us, the impact that we've had on the environment. And, here's one question. Are we like invasive species? Are we just as damaging as like the python or the cane toad in Australia, or even COVID-19? Are we just as damaging to the environment as these things are to their ecosystems that they're going into? So here's a graph. This is and this actually was something that's in your lab. I think towards the end of your lab, you have to compare the COVID-19 outbreak to human population growth. Um, if you look at these are really the same graph, just the axis is a little bit different. Um, what kind of growth do you see happening here? Like if I were to look at this section, right? What kind of growth do you see there? What's that called?
J shape.
Yeah, it's the J-shaped curve, which shows you, if you remember, it shows you exponential growth, right? Which happens when the conditions are ideal. Population grows really, really rapidly. You'll notice that there's also like a huge stretch of time when the growth is very slow. That's if you remember, it's called your lag phase. For the longest time, our population was pretty much fairly, not exactly a lot of us on this planet. So for a long time, we were undergoing what's called this lag phase. You can argue that it existed for like almost 199,800 years, because we're about 200,000 years old. So it's only been the last 200 years that we've actually started to experience this exponential growth. What's really interesting too is you can see this big indent right over here. This is caused by the plague. I don't know if you've ever come across that, like in history class. This is when Europe experienced a massive problem with It was actually a type of bacterium that caused disease carried by rats. So much more devastating than what is happening. I mean, the mortality rate was a lot higher than what's happening right now with COVID-19. But at the same time, it was easier to contain because they didn't have airplanes back then, right? It's not like if you had the plague, you got on an airplane and you could spread it to the other side of the world. But that's actually kind of cool that you can really see that indent in the human population right there. Anyway, so today we're going to talk about human impact. So I want to show you a picture, okay? Where do you think, first off, what year do you think this picture was taken in? Or decade? What decade? How about we go with that? What decade do you think this picture was taken? Anyone have a guess? This was taken about in 1950. So about 70 years ago. Okay. And basically these two, the next picture is actually the same area. Just one, I think one is facing south and I think the other one is facing north. And there's a little hint right over here. You can actually see a sign. You can kind of make out the sign. This is actually Dufferin and 401 area. So basically where Yorkdale is. I don't know if you're familiar with Yorkdale. You can see 70 years ago what this area looked like. There's obviously not a lot of buildings. You can see it's just very, very different than what you would see today. So obviously, this is something where if you think about what's happened to the environment, we've had a major, major impact. This is called urbanization, right? This is when we basically take an area that used to be kind of like farmland and we convert it into basically city land. Basically where we have houses, buildings, factories, shopping malls, stuff like that. Now, as we do this, though, obviously, when you take away natural land, it has an impact. It has an impact on the environment. Some things that would happen, for example, is that organisms that normally live there, maybe living in the trees, living in the bushes. Sometimes you have to drain lakes to put up a building. Those organisms, they lose their habitat, and the habitat disappears. Obviously, another issue is more people, more pollution. Another issue is sometimes we need to reroute water. Maybe we need to remove water from one area and move it to another area. So often you'll see things like, well, you might not see that, but you'll definitely see like this. This is a dam to control the movement of water and to use electricity, to use water as a form of making electricity. This is an interesting picture. Mariana, you should know what this is. Mariana, what is this? Are you still there? This is something called an aqueduct. So the Romans built this thousands of years ago to move water from the mountains to their cities. Because if you're going to build cities, you need to supply cities with water. Of course, what that means then is you're taking water from one area and you're moving it into another area. And that's one of the issues with, oh, we have something in the chat. Your mic isn't working. That's okay. Don't worry. That's all right. No problem. So when when you build cities, when we undergo this process called urbanization, that means, we need water, right? So that water has to come from other things. And normally it comes at the cost of, maybe removing water from rivers, from lakes, to obviously provide water for us. Now, here's the thing: there are a lot of us on this planet. We're almost up to about 8 billion people, which means we need, think about that's a lot of people. We need a lot of food, we need a lot of water. Here's an interesting graph. This graph shows you the world, but what it shows you is the areas by not their geographical size, but by the size of their population. So you can see that the two biggest are India and China. So China, 1.4 billion, India about 1.3 billion. You can see here, we're Canada right over here. We're about 37 million, kind of tiny. The US is quite big. So you can see that this is a really cool way to represent human populations around the world. And as these areas develop, they're going to need more water, more food supply. So again, when you have a lot of people and they need a lot of water and they need a lot of food, it comes at a cost. And often the cost is negative cost for plants and animals that used to live there. Here's another graph showing you growth rate, and you can see where most of the growth is happening. It's happening in Asia. You can see that right here. Okay. Most of this is, you can see in this, whatever color, this is like an orange color. Most of it is happening in Asia. This graph shows you the connection between the increase in our population, and you can see the exponential growth happening right here, with the extinction of organisms. You can see that as our population goes up, so our population is in purple, the extinction rate, in other words, organisms dying off, disappearing, is going up too, which makes sense because as we go from this to modern cities, we have to take away water and resources from organisms. In other words, we're eliminating their habitats. So they have less food, less water, less space available for them. I mean, this used to be farmland, used to be all trees. Now it's all gone. So what happened to all those animals that used to live in that area? Where do they all go? So as our population increases, then that means less resources for other organisms, which could indicate or could lead to a higher extinction rate. That's a very, very severe impact that humans have on this planet. Okay, that's one. That's one. Any questions about the connection there? And it's kind of a logical connection. The more people there are on this planet, the more space we need, the more food we need, the more water we need. Well, there's only so much space on this planet. There's only so much water on this planet. That means other things won't be getting that space, won't be getting that water, and won't be getting that food. That's kind of a logical connection. Now, the next one is, I just attribute this to, I guess, if you want to call it superstition, I just call it stupidity, is what we do to organisms. I guess you can think of it as maybe illegally, although it's not always illegal in all parts of the world. And that's when we hunt animals and kill them, not for food, but for other reasons. So, for example, here is a picture of a black bear, okay? And it said there was an issue in Quebec in 2018 where there were about, sorry, not in 2018. In 2018, they came out with an article saying that there was a problem in Quebec over the last 3 years. About 100 black bears were killed. Why do you think they were killed? Anyone have any guesses?
Because it was dangerous for humans.
Okay, you would think maybe there, yeah, because that's some, that could be a reason. In that case, there, I mean, if you're killing an animal because they pose a danger, okay, you can make the argument in that case that it's justified to do so, right? This was not what was happening here. What was happening here was these black bears were being killed not because they were dangerous, not because of food, but because certain parts of their body are seen by certain cultures as being, I'm going to say, almost like magical. In other words, if you eat like like the gallbladder, which is a part of the bear, maybe it gives you some benefit, some physical benefit. And it's not just black bears. There are a lot of other animals that, like, think of the rhinoceros. If you think about it, it has a beautiful horn. Some people believe that if uh, you can take that horn, and I think you make it into like a tea or something like that, and you drink it. It gives you it just makes you stronger, better. I'm not exactly sure of all the benefits that it. Well, it doesn't give you any benefits, but some people think that it gives you benefits, and so therefore these animals are hunted illegally for their body parts because their body parts are seen to be giving like some sort of almost like magical powers to people. This is obviously what's called a black market because this is something that you can't buy on eBay, can't buy on Amazon. This is illegal, so that means it's black market stuff. Here is a picture of these are elephant tusks, and you can see here the just the amount of tusks in this image. $48 million worth, 20 tons of illegal ivory. These are people that are going out and they're killing animals for either they're selling them because the ivory is worth a lot of money, or the body parts are worth something to somebody who's willing to pay for them because they believe that it gives them some sort of strength or something. I'm not really sure. So obviously this is a huge problem, right? People are greedy, and when you have 8 billion people on this planet, there's going to be some that are going to have really crazy ideas. And when you have crazy ideas, there's a market for people to make lots of money to sell to people that have crazy ideas. If a lot of people believe that by eating parts of a black bear, and if they eat those black bear parts, makes them stronger, makes them healthier, then that means people are going to pay for those black bear parts, which is kind of sad, but it's true. Here's another picture. Now, this isn't black market. This is totally legal, but it just shows you the idea behind when you have something that's worth a lot of money, that could be a problem. So this is a picture of a tuna, and they're quite big, actually, quite large animal. This particular one here was sold, and if you haven't seen the next slide, okay, if you haven't seen it, okay, and you don't know what the answer is, I want you to take a guess. What do you think that tuna sold for? Anyone want to take a guess? What do you think it sold for? It's actually shocking when you actually see the amount. I have a 50,300,000. I have one guess that says 50 million. I have another guess that says 300,000. Those are pretty good guesses. The answer is right here. It sold for $3 million. $3 million. $3 million. That fish sold for $3 million. That's incredible. Um, now, here's the issue. When you have, and it really goes back to the same problem with, um, you know, when there's a demand for something and people are willing to pay lots of money, that means people are going to go out and they're going to try to get those items. So if a fish is worth millions of dollars, you don't think fishermen are going to want to go out and catch them? Of course they are. If a black bear is worth, I don't know how much a black bear is worth. I heard the gallbladder could go up to like $10,000. Now, you know, if something's worth that much money, there's going to be incentive to go out and get these organisms and harvest them. So here's a graph showing you the population of tuna, Atlantic bluefin tuna. And you can see that, you know, it's since 95, it's dropped off quite significantly. And that makes sense because, hey, you know, if I'm a fisherman and I can make millions of dollars, well, I don't know, I can make millions of dollars, but I can make lots of money catching tuna, then I'm going to want to catch as many tuna as possible. So then what should governments do? Because we talked about this a little while ago. If we don't regulate that, what could happen? If the governments don't step in, what could happen to the population of Atlantic bluefin tuna? Because it looks like it's kind of stabilized. It looks like it maybe leveled off a little bit. So how could you prevent? Because here's the problem, if this is not regulated, and every fisherman goes out and catches as many fish as possible, and the population crashes all the way down to zero. Once it hits zero, that means now the population is extinct. Kind of like what happened on Easter Island. All the trees disappeared. Once you get to that point, there's no return. Can't go back. You know, once it's dead, can't go back. So what do governments have to do? They have to step in before that happens. They have to make sure that you know, that fishermen just cannot go and catch an unlimited number of fish. They have to put like a limit or a cap on how many fish can be caught, because they got to protect the organisms to make sure that they don't get wiped out. So they have to put in regulations, and you see this in Ontario. If you, I know probably none of you go out hunting and fishing, but if you were to go out hunting and fishing in Ontario, they put limits on that. You know, you just can't go out and start shooting everything, because the organisms are protected by the government to prevent like a collapse like this. Questions about human impacts so far? So we talked about, you know, just the sheer fact that as our population has grown, that's more, you know, urbanization, more demand for land, more demand for resources. The higher demand for resources means that's going to put a big strain on wildlife, other organisms, and their numbers are decreasing. The other problem with humans is, you know, we can be greedy and we can hunt things because they're worth money to somebody. That's another big problem. It's another impact that humans have on wildlife. Here's another cool one. I came across this story when I was listening to a podcast. I think it was last year. It was a park ranger. So a park ranger is like, think of like a wilderness policeman, okay? Who basically, a policeman goes into like forests, checks out rivers, streams, to make sure that people are not hunting illegally, they're not fishing illegally, they're not doing something stupid to the land. And he was walking through the forest one day, and he came across a river. And he noticed that the river was dry. There was no water in the river. It disappeared. What happened to the water? Which is actually a neat example of what we talked about before. When humans urbanize, they reroute water. They move water. They change the way the water flows. Sometimes they do it to make electricity. Sometimes they do it uh, to feed cities. That's normal. But in this case, the reason why that river was dry was really interesting. So the ranger started to follow the river, see what happened. Maybe he could find what happened to this river. Why did it go dry? What he ended up finding was a marijuana grow up, which you're seeing in this picture. Okay, you can see right here that there's a big patch that's been cleared out. Okay, and these are marijuana plants. Now, what happened is the drug cart. Oh, that was chat. Something in the chat here. What? Yeah, what? Yeah, that's true. So what happened was and I believe, if I remember correctly, I believe this was in California. What happened was the drug cartel. I don't know which drug cartel was doing, obviously undergoing illegal activity in some remote part of California, where they set up a grow op. And what they did was they moved the water uh, to supply water to the marijuana plant. So they took water from the river and they rerouted it. So you can imagine that, let's say something like this, where you imagine you have like a river. Imagine like that's my river, okay? And the water is normally flowing like this. And what happens when you reroute it is you block it off and you reroute the water. So now the water is going somewhere else. So now this part becomes all dry because it's not getting any water. The reason why they rerouted the water is because their plants, the marijuana plants, and you can see it right here, require 900 gallons of water uh, per season per plant. Per plant. So obviously you're going to need a lot of water. So when that ranger came up and he saw the river was dry, the reason why the river was dry is because the cartel rerouted the river to feed their marijuana plants. So that's like an example of where water is being redirected for, obviously, uh, in this case, greed, because again, you know, there's a lot of money in stuff like marijuana, just as there is a lot of money in ivory and a lot of money in tuna. It's kind of a crazy story. What's even more crazy is because the plants are, valuable to them, right, and they're worth a lot of money. The Not only do plants need water, but the other thing that you have to consider is you want to make sure that the plants are not eaten, right, by other things, by other animals. So you want to give them water, but you also want to make sure that they're protected. So what's really interesting is that the pesticide that they use to make sure that the plants are safe from insects and other things like herbivores that would rather, would otherwise eat the marijuana, is so toxic that they used it in Africa. I don't know if they still use it, but they used to use it to kill lions. Think about that for a second, right? This pesticide is used to protect marijuana plants is so poisonous that it kills lions. It's so poisonous that when the ranger was talking about this experience, and they found the grow ops, they had to be so careful when getting rid of these plants. They could not get the stuff on their skin because otherwise it would cause major medical problems. Yeah, but again, kind of makes sense because if these plants are worth millions of dollars, you're going to want to make sure that they are protected. Yeah, kind of craziness though, eh? Very crazy stuff. Okay. Um, Any questions? We have one last topic to look at in terms of human impact, and then we are going to wrap up. Any questions from the chat? Nothing? Okay, the last thing we'll talk about when it comes to human impacts is the impacts we've had in terms of what's something called the garbage patch, the ocean garbage patches. And again, when you have about 8 billion people on this planet, you're going to need a lot of space, you need a lot of water, a lot of food. The other thing to consider is that many people produce a lot of pollution. Sometimes, and oftentimes actually, that pollution ends up in places that we don't want it to go. In this map here, it shows you areas of where we find these accumulations of garbage. And right here, you can see something called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's not just here, find them other places around the world. And what happens is you have accumulation of garbage. And the accumulation could be very, very big. So what happens is when people dump garbage on the beaches and overboard into the ocean, they accumulate in certain areas. Sometimes they end up on beaches of other countries. And this is a huge, huge problem because these things that we're throwing that end up in the ocean, they're toxic. The other problem is they actually physically affect the living things in the ocean, which then is obviously a double whammy, because not only is the garbage itself toxic and releasing toxins, and we're talking about bioaccumulation, right? You release poisons, and the little things accumulate the poisons. The bigger things eat a lot of the little things, so they accumulate more of the poison. And then the bigger fish accumulate more of the poison because they eat a lot of the little fish, which ate a lot of the smaller organisms. So that's one problem. But the other problem you can see here is that sometimes these things physically end up killing the organism. Maybe the organism might get trapped in the garbage. You see, sometimes you see, like, if you Google this, you might see like birds with stuff caught around their neck, or it's just you could see that it kind of illustrated here. So to recap, obviously, almost 8 billion people. That means we're going to have a huge, huge impact on our environment. Okay, let me stop recording, and then I'll take questions.